Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. And first of all, Happy New Year and Merry Christmas because, contrary to popular belief, you heathens, it's actually still the Christmas season officially until the Feast of Epiphany, which is actually when the wise men showed up, which I believe is January 9th and this year. And in some places, at least traditionally, they even celebrate it way longer than that. But don't worry, we won't make you keep your Christmas decorations up past Epiphany. It's okay. Um, in fact, which day of Christmas is this, Clay?
I think today's the eighth day of
There you go,
Christmas.
the eighth day of Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas. That's a thing, by the way. It's not just a song, and incidentally, it's also a song that was sung in, I think it was Elizabethan England, at least post Henry VIII England, that was sort of clandestinely used to help teach the Catholic faith to children because you weren't allowed to be Catholic, by the way. It was one of those punishable by death things. Ask
But we
St.
got
Thomas.
Hamlet out of it, so
I mean, that's cool. I mean, Hamlet's cool. Uh, but
it's only the greatest play ever written.
it, like I said, Hamlet's cool. It seems a little reductive to say it that way, but I work with what I've got. Um, fun, fun story actually. Before we get going, Clay, I once walked into the living room. This was a couple of years ago now, and I caught my oldest reading Hamlet, laying on the living room floor while listening to Tchaikovsky. So just saying, that's that's cool. My teenager is better than your teenager, people out there. Just saying. Uh, yes, it is a contest. Anyway, as you see, Clay is back finally to kind of
Yeah,
continue,
don't fall
and
asleep on me this time, Ginger.
I'll do my best. If you guys recall, the last time Clay was here, uh, he was educating us a bit on the history of cars in general and NASCAR in particular, and all the kind of the roots of all of that. And I had to cut it short because I was in the midst of having the COVID, and I was gonna die, so I had to shut it down so I didn't die live on YouTube because that would probably violate an algorithm. But I obviously recovered from that just fine, and incidentally, it overall was no big deal. That actually, literally the next morning, I woke up and I was fine. Like
Oh,
it,
of course.
like it felt like it was all gone the next morning. It was amazing. It was the weirdest thing. It went from like the worst the worst day that I had with it to just gone. I
Oh,
was like,
of course. Of course.
I'm, I'm sorry, my wife is signaling to me. I'm not sure what she's signaling, um, because neither one of us do American Sign Language, so yeah, she was reminding me that I did take the horse paste. So
Ah, okay.
at the very least, I definitely know it won't kill you. So
Well, that's good. Yeah,
and
don't die.
it probably did help. So
Yes.
anyway, Clay is back to kind of continue that conversation, and much to my chagrin, as I was explaining before we went live, I was not able to take the time to watch Ford v Ferrari, but I am curious to learn more reasons why I should actually take that disc and pop it in the Blu-ray player.
Yeah, well, it's only the greatest event in motorsports history that's ever happened.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's
yeah.
cool.
Um, so for this, we have to start really back in the 1950s. So World War II happens. You have a lot of people who are uh, rum runners, moonshiners, bootleggers of all sorts, and this is really where car culture began.
Hmm.
And you have this starting up in the South, and then also after World War II, you have a thing called the sports car, which is a car built particularly for performance, not
Hmm.
reliability. Sports cars have not really become reliable up until the last 10, 20 years or so, um, which is why they were mainly a weekend car. But yeah, you go from World War II, where aerodynamics is just starting to be tampered with.
Hmm.
You have P-38s that just hammered their if you put enough fuel in the thing, it'll fly a long time. And then you get the P-51 that really started to play with aerodynamics. But then you don't really get that a lot with cars. In the 1950s, you have tail fins because people like P-38s aesthetically, and so they wanted them on their cars. That's actually where that comes from. Tail
No
fins come
kidding.
from P-38s. Yeah.
No kidding. Huh.
hmm And there's certain classes of cars that, if you look at them, the tail fin goes out,
Hmm.
and then it has a little bump, which is the same as the tail of a P-38.
No kidding.
Yeah.
That is weird. But yeah,
Yes.
I had to look it up. I thought I knew. I thought I remember what it looked like, and sure enough. But yeah, huh? That's crazy. I did not know that about the stupid tail fins.
Yeah. It's because people like P-38s. But then, so 1950s you have, or really in the 1940s you have NASCAR, and in Europe as well as really California, you have sports car racing starting to become a thing. Um, in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And this adage becomes very popular: win on Monday, or win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Where, most of these cars are stock cars. You soup them up, you take them to the racetrack, you win, and the manufacturer's happy about it. Uh, However, a thing happened in the 1950s that it was a bad luck for car manufacturers to, really be advertising racing. Like, imagine today
Yeah.
like Dodge or Chevy or one of these companies saying, well, in fact, Toyota actually does it a little bit, where it's Kyle Busch drives our cars. You should drive our cars.
Ah.
Um, but it's in the 1950s they banned all of that, so the car manufacturers were not allowed to advertise whatsoever
Hmm.
their race winnings. So uh, Ford, Henry Ford II, not Junior because he's Edsel Ford's son, and Edsel Ford is the son of Henry Ford. So uh, Henry Ford II
Hmm.
takes over Ford Motor Company in the 40s, and he becomes the president of this new safety commission. Um, you know, no money in racing. Well, a lot of that changes in the 1960s because Chevy did a thing called not following the rules. In order to win in NASCAR, your car had to be a stock car. That's why it's
Hmm.
National Association of Stock Car Auto Racing.
Right.
Chevy determined if you sell a race car at the dealership, then it'll be legal to race. And so there's
Seems
these things.
reasonable.
Yeah, so there were these things called Chevy Black Widows, which it's a normal 57 Chevy Bel Air,
Uh huh.
except you soup up the engine and you take the back seat out of it and you do some other stuff to the springs. And because it comes from the dealership, it's legal. It
Oh, I
was,
love it.
yeah, it was under this thing called the like GM Marine Engine Program. Nothing
All
to
right.
do with boat engines at all. It
Doesn't
was
sound like it.
no, it was all Chevy saying, we're going to pour money into racing. And everybody knew it. It was
I,
called the
I I like. I kind of appreciate a little bit of that creative bending the rules.
yeah, it was called the worst kept secret in Detroit.
Right.
Everybody knew Chevy was racing. Chevy was winning because of that, and Chevy was selling more cars because of that.
Wow.
So,
Good business plan.
yeah, so in the 1960s, the Corvette comes out. Ford creates a car called the Thunderbird to
Hmm.
compete with the Corvette. But then they discover if you put back seats in a car, more people will buy it. So a Thunderbird went from a wannabe sports car like the Corvette to a more of a luxury type car that
Hmm.
Ford was putting out. And Ford was getting sick and tired of their image of being an old man's car of, you know, like by the end of the 1950s of just like, why would I get a Ford? That's like what my dad has. Um,
Right.
I want a Corvette. I want something fast, fancy. Um, and so with the Thunderbird failing, Ferrari is up for sale, and Ford had seen uh, Ferrari's win at Sebring in
Hmm.
1962. Now, before we go any further, we have to go back because Ferrari has a side of the story as well.
Okay.
So after World War II, Ferrari, his factory is in shambles, and so he sends a guy out named Luigi Canetti to America to help sell cars. And Ferrari used prior to the war raced for Alfa Romeo, and when he left, he had a stipulation in his contract that said you can't sell cars under your own name for the next 5 years.
Hmm.
World War II happens, and that 5 years is taken up. So Ferrari starts producing cars again, and selling them through Luigi Canetti in America. Uh, the first Le Mans is after World War II, I believe, is in 1949, and Ferrari wins it. And Ferrari goes on to win a couple more races or a couple more Le Mans in the 1950s, and then Jaguar gets their act together,
Hmm.
beats them. Then Ferrari beats Jaguar in 58, and then in I think it's 1959, Aston Martin beats uh Ferrari. Yeah, Aston Martin beats Ferrari. This is where Ford versus Ferrari opens up because Carroll Shelby was racing for Aston Martin at the time,
Hmm.
and Carroll Shelby had a interesting start, which is neither here nor there. And Ferrari has an interesting start, or I'm sorry, Shelby has an interesting start, which is neither here nor there. Basically, he failed at raising chickens. A friend asked, "Will you do this race for me?" Shelby says yes, and he's really good at it. And so he continues to race in Texas and then Southern California, and then in 1959 his heart stops working, and so he's forced to pull out of racing,
Hmm. Excuse me.
which
Just
is alrighty.
all right. Had to deal with that.
That's fine. Um, so he has to pull out of racing, but he builds his own car, which is good because the Chevys are winning, and Ford wants to have cars that are Ford powered or Fords winning that I
Hmm.
related earlier. So Henry Ford II is at Sebring, watches a Ferrari win, decides Ferrari through racing has become unpopular in Italy because of a race where people died, and the laws in Italy at the time were if your car is involved in a crash and it kills somebody, you are held legally liable.
Oh.
Yeah. So
Wow.
so there was an investigation and it was deemed a motor racing accident. Uh because those things happen. And Ferrari, who was the love of Italy, has now become the most hated thing in Italy. And Ferrari was a master manipulator of the press. So what does he do? He needs to be on everybody's good side in Italy, and the way to do that is by saying goodbye to Italy. I'm going to sell my company to America.
All right.
Yeah, and so this is
Bold
where
move.
this is where the negotiations begin. In 1962 between
Hmm.
Ford and Ferrari. The movie makes it look like it happened over 5 minutes. And the reality is it took over a year, and Ford spent $2 million trying to get this deal to come together.
Wow.
This isn't $2 million in today's money. This is $2
Right.
million in 1963
Yeah,
money.
$2 million went a lot farther back then.
Yeah. And so Ferrari basically says no. They were signing paperwork at 10 o'clock at night, and Ferrari goes over this passage that he says, if I want to race at Indianapolis,
Mhm.
and because the original, before I get to that, the original rule was for Ferrari Ford, the new company name, to where Ford owned 90% of manufacturing and Ferrari owned 90% of the race team.
Mhm.
And Ferrari said, well, if I want to go to Indianapolis, do I get to decide that, or do you get to decide that? And Ford said, well, we get to decide that because it's our money that you're playing with.
Mhm.
And Ferrari's like, well, this isn't fair. And everybody's like, well, Mr. Ferrari, you're selling your company.
Yeah.
And so Ferrari storms out, makes a big scene, 10 o'clock at night, tells his lawyer that, come on, let's go, we're going to go eat. And the Michigan suits get back to Dearborn and they tell Mr. Ford, and Mr. Ford is not happy because he just got played. A few years later, Fiat buys Ferrari and keeps everything within Italy. In 1962, because Ford wants to sell cars, Ford's all fired up. So he leaves the safety commission, calls out GM in the process.
Okay.
That because Ford leaves, says, we're going racing. We're not going to apologize for going racing. And Chevy's like, well, you can't do this. And Henry Ford II literally told the CEO of GM, shut up, we know you're racing. This is all in the public at a press conference.
Uh-huh. That sounds like fun.
Yeah. And so Ford enters NASCAR, IndyCar, drag racing, sports cars with Carroll Shelby and his Shelby Cobra, just everywhere. And he starts to design the GT40, which is based off of the Mustang concept car, which also becomes the Ford Mustang. So those two cars have a common ancestor. 1964 happens where they have this car all built. The guy heading up the program, his name is John Wyer. He's the one who beat Ferrari in 1959. And it's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster. Ford's cars failed to make it even halfway through the race. Yeah, Henry Ford II is pissed. He then calls in Carroll Shelby because Carroll Shelby placed third overall in his car, or his owned cars, and so he takes over from John Wyer in 1965. 1965 comes, and they win Daytona. They win Sebring, technically, but that's a whole story in it of itself. Basically, there was a car that was entered that wasn't legal, and everybody asked if they could compete. Everybody said yes, as long as they don't get the trophy, because they're obviously going to win. They win, and they get all the media attention.
I see.
Yeah, so but Ford technically wins in 65 at Sebring. And then everything's looking great going into Le Mans. Ford engineers change the rebuild the engines the night before the race, and they forgot to heat treat some of the parts, so they stretch, and the Le Mans venture in 65 is foiled. In the meanwhile, Ferrari wins Le Mans in 1960, 61, 62, 63, and 64. 1965, they won as a manufacturer, but there was a falling out between Luigi Canetti, who I mentioned earlier, who was selling cars
Mhm.
in America. He also had a race team racing Ferraris. In fact, the car he used was actually a year or two older than the current cars that Ferrari
Hmm.
raced in 1965. And so Luigi Canetti wins Le Mans. This is the first time an American team has ever won Le Mans. And so Ford goes to his company and he pulls everybody together and he tells them, "You better win, or else." Um, so Ford grabs everybody. He grabs their NASCAR guys, their um, sports car guys from
Mhm.
England, U.S., France, everywhere. Two biggest names though are Holman Moody, which is their NASCAR development, which at the time Ford is just absolutely dominating in NASCAR. Um, in 1963, uh, Ford destroys everybody at Daytona. In 1965, Ford wins every race except for 7 during the NASCAR season, and these are like 40 race seasons.
Mhm. That's
Uh,
impressive.
yeah, but it doesn't matter as long as they don't win Le Mans. They also won the 1965 Indy 500. So Ford is just absolutely dominating motorsports, and their sales are going through the roof. But they're not winning Le Mans.
Mhm.
So 1966 rolls around, and they make changes to the GT40. Uh, it becomes formally known as the Mark II, which basically looks the same as a Mark One. And they go out and they win. But there's shenanigans being played the entire time behind the scenes, basically,
Mhm.
where Ford decided who won because
Hmm.
Ken Miles was Ford's best driver. He was an American citizen, but if you've seen the movie, for anybody who's watching this, and Ginger, you'll come to find this out.
Uh-huh.
Not the best family or not the best people person. Very fiery, very uncouth, not a people person. Uh, had something on his mind, was going to say it. Meanwhile, there was another driver at the Ford camp named Bruce McLaren. This is also the name that the company McLaren has
Mhm.
gotten. And he had been with the program since 1964. And so Ford asked the officials, "Can we have a 1-2-3 tie um, with our cars?" And the officials said yes. And then after the last pit stop, they told them both. The officials went back to Ford and said, "No, you can't. The rules state that if you have a car that started further back, that car technically went a longer distance, so that's the car that wins, um, according to a qualifying order."
That's funny.
Yeah, so Bruce McLaren wins in 1966. Um, Ken Miles doesn't. Um, I know you aren't going to watch the movie, but this is kind of a spoiler, but it's also very important to the
That's
story.
okay. Go ahead.
Um, Ken Miles is killed in a crash at the end of 1966 testing a car. Um, there's different reports on what happened. Officially, Ford it says it's unknown what happened. There's other people who claim, though, that Ford very much knew what happened, that the transmission locked up and the car went into a roll and disintegrated, and Miles was thrown from the car and was killed.
Oh, that's no fun.
Yeah. In the movie, they make it that it was the brakes that failed,
Mhm.
because the brakes are a part of the storyline, but just to for an audience thing, that's what they blamed it on. But the uh, real reason is more thought to have been a transmission issue. Um, so Ford just lost their best driver. And even though they won in 1966 and defeated Ferrari, the
Mm-hmm.
story isn't over. Because in 1967, at the 24 Hours of Daytona, which is the first race in the sports car series, Ferrari gets a 1-2-3 finish, and all of the Fords fail. And so they build a new car called the Mark IV. I actually have the race-winning car behind me. I will grab that. So this is the car that Ken Miles helped develop. It's a lot more sleek. It's about a design that is really 20 years behind. I'm sorry, 20 years ahead of its time. You wouldn't see boxy cars like that racing at Le Mans until the 1980s. And so they do that with all-American parts, a all-American team of Dan Gurney and AJ Foyt, and they win in 67. Ford leaves at the end of 1967 after completing their motorsport dominance.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, John Wyer takes over the program, and he proceeds to win in 1968 and 1969. Ferrari never wins at Le Mans on the top level ever again. 50 years later, Ford builds a new Ford GT, takes it back to Le Mans, and wins again. Ferrari side of the story shouldn't be left out either, because that's very interesting, where Enzo had arguably the best driver in the world. His name was John Surtees. He was an English driver, the only driver ever to win on motorcycles and four wheels. One in motorbikes and in Formula One. And Ferrari starts to divert more and more resources away from his F1 team and to his sports car team, because he does not want Ford to win. And he's successful in 64 and 65, like I said, and after that, he's done. Ford then has all this aerodynamics research that they've had, and they're just sitting on it. They have nothing to do with it. So they take it to NASCAR, where I showed last week, or not last week, the last time.
Yeah.
If you go watch that, I had some die casts of a Plymouth Superbird and a Ford Torino Talladega. So Ford brings their aerodynamics stuff to NASCAR, and they dominate there. And Chrysler does their thing, and you have the Aero Wars, which I talked about last time. And yeah, all of this is summed up. Of course, go watch Ford versus Ferrari. Adam Carolla made a documentary called The 24-Hour War, which is very good. And then there's a book called Go Like Hell, which details everything from 1962 to 1966 in detail.
Now, how much of all of that does the movie actually cover?
The movie covers 63 pretty well. It covers parts of 1964. It completely leaves out 1965. And then it shows a little bit of 1966.
So the movie covers a bit of a span of time.
Yeah, it does.
Which that wasn't the impression I got from the trailer. But mostly the impression I got from, I mean, it's just a trailer, you know. But
yeah.
The impression I got from it was friendly competition, one race sort of thing. And, you know, being that I don't know.
Blood sport.
Gotcha, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Being that I don't know, you know, squat about the history of cars, really, that was kind of my impression. And, of course, I was like, that's a real thing. Because being a layman on such things, I'm like, yeah, Ford is kind of generic car company, mostly makes trucks, and Ferrari, well, makes
Yeah.
Ferraris. So I was like, huh, they actually were competitive at some point. That's cool. Didn't know that.
Yeah, Ford still produces a sports car,
Yeah.
which is $400,000. And you have to be selected by Ford in order to buy one. You have to write a resume into Ford on why you should own this car, and then they get to decide if you own it or not.
What is this insane vehicle?
This is the modern Ford GT, which,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's. I have one right here. This is a model of the race car.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically this car without the giant wing on the back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you
Well, that
ever,
would be cool.
yeah, if you ever make it down to the Henry Ford Museum, they
Mm-hmm.
have this car, the real car, sitting in the museum with the
Nice.
67 GT40 Mark IV that I showed earlier.
That's cool.
Yeah. Um, I've managed to get to go to a couple of sports car races where those Ford GTs were racing. Um,
Nice.
yeah, the first year I went, they sounded exactly like a P-51 Mustang. It was pretty cool.
Huh. That's kind of fascinating.
Yeah.
The okay, so I've first got to ask. Well, actually, two. It's a two-part question. One, why did this particular subject attract so much of your attention? And two, how on earth did you go about learning, obviously, so much about the history of this? Because clearly you are like a fountain of information on this.
Yeah, so basically it's everything that I said. It's the book Go Like Hell, which
Mm-hmm.
is written by a guy named AJ Blaine. It covers everything from 1962 to 1966 in detail. There's a lot in there that I didn't talk about. I believe in the 1965 Sebring race, which the Sebring racetrack is on an old World War II airfield. It's all concrete down in Florida. And in 65, it flooded. Like 2 inches of water flooded. And they raced in that. And I was really hoping that was going to be in the movie, but it wasn't.
That would have
They
been
said,
cool.
yeah, in the 24-hour war documentary, one of the mechanics was saying that when you were changing tires, you had to be careful that it didn't float away. Yeah,
Not an everyday problem.
no. So yeah, it's basically just the between the documentary and the book is where I learned a lot of this. My grandpa uh, got my dad, or my grandpa found out about the book. My dad got it for him for Christmas, and I got the audiobook, and I've read it 2 or 3 times now. So, or listened to it for anybody who wants to be particular about such things. So,
Wow. Okay, but what was it about this that attracted your interest so much?
um, it's really it is a David versus Goliath story. And it really on first glance it's like, "Oh yeah, well, it's more like a, the Goliath that Ford is, versus tiny little Ferrari." But when you actually look about it in knowledge,
Hmm.
um Ford had nothing to do with sports car racing. They knew little to nothing about
Hmm.
this. And Ferrari, like I demonstrated earlier, was winning every other race from 19 what's it like 1949 all the way to 1965.
It's a good run.
But yeah, but uh yeah, so it was the David versus Goliath story, and it really
Hmm.
wasn't Ford, it was Shelby American, which started out of California. Um
Hmm.
I think in off Venice Beach. Was just this. tiny little shop, and um, but yeah, it's this incredible story of just, you know, Ford wanting this, going to Carroll Shelby, and Carroll Shelby making it a reality. And there's I like cars. I like I like history. Um, I mentioned earlier, auto racing during this time was a blood sport. It There were a lot of people killed, and even over the course of this Ford versus Ferrari war, there were a lot of people killed. Um, Carroll Shelby actually did not drive for Enzo Ferrari at any given point in time because Carroll Shelby thought Enzo Ferrari was a killer. Enzo Ferrari determined that his drivers needed to give 110% whenever they were racing, and it
Hmm.
got a lot of people killed. Um, in the 19, what was it? 62 or 63, it was considered the dream team of all these drivers that Ferrari had put together.
Hmm.
And I think by 1975 they were all dead by motor racing accidents.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is why Hemingway called the three real sports mountain climbing, bullfighting, and auto racing. The three real sports. Um, Auto racing was not what it is today, where you strap into this harness and um, whatever happens to the car, you're going to walk away from it.
Yeah, unless you get hit with a missile, you're probably going to be fine.
hmm Yeah. Back then, these cars were basically stock cars with
Hmm.
all the safety features of a car from the 1960s. y- Open face
All
helmets.
of them.
Yeah. Open. Well, you did have a racing harness, but there were no crumple zones. There were no nothing.
Right.
Um, if you hit a wall at 200 miles per hour, you were hitting a wall at 200 miles per hour. So I think it was, just the insanity of all of this as well. I've often called race car drivers and fighter pilots different sides of the same coin. You have to be a little insane to do what you're doing. And for a
Right.
fighter pilot, it's a three-dimensional roller coaster, where you're not necessarily looking to kill the other person, but you're looking to shoot them down to destroy their airplane.
Hmm.
And driving a race car is the exact same thing, except um, you're not trying to kill your opponent in front of you, and it's two-dimensional instead of three. Um, but when you start to break it down, it really is more or less the same thing. In
It just
fact,
requires a similar mindset in terms of
yeah,
just you're going really fast, and the slightest screw up can kill you.
yeah, and there's something impressive to be dancing on a razor thin margin of error,
Hmm.
and be able to step up to that line, dance on it for, in Lamoth's case, 24 hours. Um, for each, there were typically two drivers, so 12 hours apiece, and then walking away from that. Which, I mean, if you look at B-17 crews, fighter pilots, some of those missions could last up to 8 hours. You're doing the same thing.
Right.
In fact, the first U.S. top ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, was a race car driver. He competed at
Huh.
Indianapolis Motor at the Indy 500, I think, 3 or 4 times. He never won, but still, I mean, this is a guy who was a race car driver turned fighter pilot.
Hmm. Yes. It kind of it takes I guess what Whittle would refer to as a steely-eyed missile man
Yeah,
to kind of get behind the wheel and do that sort of thing. Especially
yeah.
back then when you've got all the safety features of a 1960s car.
Well, I don't even want to say back then because Dale Earnhardt was killed in a crash in 2001.
True. True. Not
And
that long ago.
there were still other crashes that have claimed people's lives in IndyCar up until very recently. Um, so the harsh realities of motor racing, as we've been talking about, the 1960s and the 1970s actually aren't that far away.
It's true enough.
Yeah, so there is something admirable to be seen in watching somebody dance up to that line and then walk away, but sometimes you slip. Um, Bruce McLaren slipped, Ken Miles slipped. Um, and sometimes it's not even these guys' own faults. The car breaks. Um, it's just stuff happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. And there just aren't many places like that left in the world, you know?
Yeah, I mean, as much fun as it is to glamorize a lot of this stuff, it should be left in the past for a reason. I don't want to watch anybody die again. I watched that
Yeah,
race
was
where
yeah.
Earnhardt was killed, so I don't want to watch anybody die again. The closest I came was the 2016, I believe, Coca-Cola 400 at or it was Coke Zero or whatever at Daytona, where Austin
Right.
Dillon hit the catch fence and his car was absolutely ripped apart, and um, there were a lot of drivers who it wasn't until 20 minutes later that they didn't know he was still alive. Yeah, I'll send you the video of the
Mm-hmm.
wreck later, and you'll be surprised that somebody crawled away from that wreck. But a lot of the drivers got PTSD from what they did. They still went
Oh,
back
gee.
to it, but
Mm-hmm.
they had PTSD. Phil Hill, who is a prominent name in the Ford versus Ferrari
Okay.
conflict. You don't see
Mm-hmm.
him in the movie, but in the book, very obviously had PTSD from what he did. Um, in the movie Rush, which is an excellent movie, but probably not one you should watch with small children around. That one's a bit more adult.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the competitors, James Hunt, is seen throwing up before every race because he's terrified to get into that car. And that was not an uncommon thing.
Huh. That's interesting. I
Hmm.
guess the guys that have been in wrecks or had a friend in probably maybe had a friend in one or something like that.
Everybody knew somebody who was killed in a car.
Right. Yeah, and back in the days when, like I had said previously, when I would watch some NASCAR over at my grandparents' house, who again were huge into it. Yeah, I saw a
Hmm.
few of those wrecks, and ooh, the
Yeah,
fact that
yeah.
anybody would walk away from some of these things is impressive.
Hmm. Yeah, so it's just one of those things, and it is very fun to go and look back at these real life daredevils that
Yeah.
we don't have anymore, or we don't have a lot of, and so it's interesting to see something, um a type of courage that you typically only see in warfare in a more controlled setting. um
Hmm.
that's we were talking before about this, of how there's usually a religious truth behind the pagan one.
Hmm.
And I mean, in this life, you could even compare, sports, especially these high speed, dangerous sports,
Hmm.
on a more perfected version of what warfare should be. That spirit of competition is still there, and
Hmm.
the possibility of death is still there. But you're not looking to kill anybody. You're not looking to, rape, scour, burn,
Right.
anybody. You're just here for raw competition. So I
Yeah.
think
It's
there's something yeah.
yeah. It is kind of how we still do sort of that same thing. So
Hmm.
that same sort of competitive edge. That whole you've got to go out and do something that is physical and tangible and challenging, and that pits you against somebody else. Yeah, back in the day, it was my ancestors might have made a certain name for themselves and their illicit activities going up and down Europe's coastlines, but which of course that's not an endorsement. That's NASCAR
Yeah.
racing, much better way to get those urges out.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I'm getting at. But it's true that that is an impulse that can be very good when channeled appropriately. And I think one of the unfortunate things of the modern world is that instead of trying to channel it appropriately, they've tried to stamp it out.
Yeah. I mean, I love going airsofting. I love
Right.
having a rifle in my hand and being in this controlled setting where hopefully nobody's going to get seriously hurt, but still play some type of war game.
Hmm.
I like racing for the same reason. It gives me a lot of the same emotions. And especially if you look at male physiology, which
Hmm.
we're not supposed to talk about today, um, when men watch something, and this is part of the reason why porn is so bad, that when men watch something, they're experiencing it as if they were in the cockpit.
Hmm.
So for a man watching a race, it's a man seeing himself in the cockpit of that car. Um, watching a movie like Battle of Britain, it's you're seeing yourself as a fighter pilot in
Hmm.
this situation. Um, and it's really something that we've lost the ability to go out and do.
Yeah. Yeah, I would completely agree. And I identify it with when I was doing martial arts sparring. Oh, I love sparring. I love throwing on the gloves or throwing on the gi and just going on the mat and getting into it.
Yeah,
So much fun. And win or win or lose, I'm having a good time.
yeah.
I'm having a good time because I'm doing
It's only
something
not
that
fun if
fits.
you step up there and then you immediately lose. But
Exactly.
as long as you have a fighting chance, even
Hmm.
if you lose, you're having fun.
Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, it's especially it's good to test yourself. It's good to push yourself
Hmm.
in some sort of way like that. Whatever. Find whatever it is that gets you in particular going. I, whether it's airsofting, martial arts, racing,
If
whatever.
if you
You know.
race, do it legally,
Yes,
not
legally. This is not saying go find the dirt roads around the old quarry and start racing. No, 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 no. That's probably
no.
a bad idea. That probably will get you killed. It will almost certainly get you in jail for a night or two.
Yeah, yeah. Don't. Um, if you want to go out and cannonball, do it safely. Um,
Yeah, yeah, no kidding. And definitely don't go start, robbing banks or something just for the adrenaline rush. You can surf, but don't surf and be part of the dead presidents. That's bad. Okay.
yeah,
You're not Patrick Swayze. You're not Keanu Reeves. Just don't do it. And I have no idea who was in that crappy remake that they made, but and neither does anyone else because I don't think anyone watched it. I actually saw it scrolling through HBO, and I'm like, do I wanna? No, I don't care. I don't. I don't even care how lame this is.
yeah. It's yeah.
Did you?
Didn't expect me to
It's
get philosophical about a racing movie, but
yeah. Well, it can happen. So, Days of Thunder, good racing movie or not?
cheesy but fun.
Good. I think that's an acceptable answer.
It's not. I haven't seen Talladega Nights, but it's not Talladega
Oh,
Nights. It's
uh,
um I just don't like Will Ferrell at all, so I don't like the
I
movie
am
Elf
with
either.
you 100%. I cannot stand Will Ferrell.
Yeah, so
Just no.
um yeah, fun thing about Days of Thunder that's actually kind of based off of a real thing that happened in NASCAR in the 1980s.
No kidding.
Um yeah, between driver Jeff Bodine and Dale Earnhardt. Jeff Bodine and Dale Earnhardt hated each other. This was not the 1990s Dale Earnhardt versus Jeff Gordon, where they hated each other on the track and off the track they were friends. This was they actually hated each other. Um, the In fact, they tried to get Dale Earnhardt to play Michael Rooker's character for the movie.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and Dale read the script and he looked at it and he set it down and he's like, "I'm the bad guy? I'm not the bad guy." And he said, Dale Jr. was saying that everybody stopped and looked at Dale Sr. and are just like, "You are you joking right now?" But yeah, Days of Thunder is loosely based off of the Jeff Bodine Dale Earnhardt rivalry in the 1980s.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah. At one
That's
point,
funny.
Rick Hendrick told Jeff Bodine, Rick Hendrick was the car owner. He still
Mm,
has a team today with um, notable drivers of Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson who have retired and
mhm.
all them. But yeah, Rick told Jeff Bodine, do something about Earnhardt, or I'll find a driver who will. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so Richard Childress, Rick Hendrick, Jeff Bodine, and Dale Earnhardt were sat down in NASCAR's office. This is a scene in the Days of Thunder movie, and NASCAR told them, "You are going to stop right now, or the four of you in this room will not have a future in this sport."
Okay. So,
Yeah.
so the whole rubbing his racing thing, that's real in the context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It uh it's used to NASCAR was one of the few motorsports that is a full contact sport. Um, in other sports series, if you so much as tap a guy, you're going to get a penalty.
Mhm.
In NASCAR, and this goes all the way back to the 1950s and 1940s, that short of wrecking the other guy, do what you have to do to win. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, NASCAR in the Gen 5 and Gen 6 era kind of got away from that because the cars became too fragile. They became
Mhm.
too demanding. But with the new next gen car, they're looking at trying to bring some of that back.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's an interesting move.
yeah, they want more full contact NASCAR.
Huh.
But yeah, that if you go and look at some of the beating and banging from the 1980s and the 1990s and even earlier, it NASCAR was a full contact sport. If you got into somebody and you wrecked them, it's like, oh well.
Like, yeah, things happen.
hmm If it was a very deliberate, last lap of the race, and I intentionally spun you out, um, and gave you zero way for you to win, then I'm going to get a penalty. But if I get alongside you and I bump into you and I put you into the wall and now I'm in front of you, but you're still in racing contention. Well,
It's just like a full body. It's just like a checking into the boards in hockey, right?
yeah, yeah,
No big
it's
deal.
yeah,
Just how the game's played.
yeah. Beat and bang as long as you want, and just try not to destroy your car in the process.
Wow.
Yeah,
See, I was kind of had I was always kind of under the impression that was a little bit of Hollywood license. That's
no,
not.
they over exaggerated how much they wreck, but the
Hmm.
whole rubbing is racing thing, um, you're not going to see it at bigger tracks. Actually, you'll probably see it at Daytona and Talladega, just because that's a 200-mile-per-hour traffic jam. Um, which for some reason people in California think they can do that. I've been in bumper to bumper traffic here in California
Uh-huh.
that's going 80 miles per hour. It it's
Um,
very
it's
stressful.
not just California. It's also kind of around DC.
Okay.
I've referred to DC as you're you're playing you're playing mobile Jenga at 80 miles an hour.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
And it's like you're in, you're out, and
Mhm.
it's very dangerous, and you have to pay very much attention to what you're doing because, well, yeah, if you mess up, it's not going to be fun.
Yeah, it's the you have somebody who's navigating who's not used to the area, and it's like, oh look, there was your exit, and it's like, I needed to know that like 10 miles ago.
Yeah. Thanks, Google.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um.
Fortunately, these days we got to at least have Google to give us the heads up. A couple miles down the road at least.
Yeah. But the that's the appeal of why NASCAR is also moving to have more short tracks on the schedule. Because at the intermediate tracks, that are about between a mile and a mile and a half, those
Hmm.
tracks are a little too aero dependent, so you can't really beat and bang that much. But
Okay.
at a half-mile track, or maybe even a 1 mile track, um, you can beat and bang a lot more. And
Now, why is that?
uh, because it's a lot more based off of driver skill and
Okay.
raw power of the car, rather than your car being needing to be as aerodynamic as possible.
I see. There's a lot less of a straight run
Yeah,
where that's going to
it's
matter.
yeah, you push the accelerator to the floor coming out of a corner, and
Hmm.
then you wait for the car to redline, and you immediately hit the brakes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so you at those smaller tracks you can beat and bang a lot more. But
Okay.
I mean, closing laps of um, any type of track, it's a free for all.
Yeah. Huh. See, that's almost enough to it's almost enough to get me interested to watch some NASCAR if I ever had the spare time, which
Yeah, at least watch the Daytona
isn't likely.
500. Well, if you see on Twitter that it's going to the last 20 laps, that would be a time to turn on the
Time
TV.
to check it out.
Hmm.
Well, all right. Um, and uh as far as things like time goes, this quick little um update. My schedule is going to continue to be for a few weeks here, but I'm going to have a little bit of spare time coming up, and that's about all I'll say about that for the moment, because things are moving apace towards getting us moved down south into
Sweet.
to the land of heat and gators and rattlesnakes.
We just have the rattlesnakes. We don't really have the gators here.
No, that's the thing. That's one thing you don't have in California, which is good.
Well, just because we don't have them, I mean, my grandpa has a lot of experience with gators. Um, it There's a bunch of movies from between the 1940s to the 1960s that my dad's side of the family supplied the alligators for a lot of those movies.
No kidding.
Hmm. So
Okay,
like there's a musical called The Happiest Millionaire that Bethany really likes, and my grandpa was like, in the movie there's this eccentric um millionaire, and he has a bunch of alligators roaming around the house, and my grandpa was the animal coordinator for that movie.
okay, we're gonna have to have you on to discuss that
Well,
in the
you're going
in
to
the
have
future.
me on for like crazy animal stories, World War II. I mean, everybody missed the discussion we were having about how moral the atomic bomb droppings were. So,
Right. Oh yeah,
um,
yeah. We can definitely have you on to do a lot of different discussions, and I think that'd be a lot of fun.
yeah, if
But
you have a guest cancel, let me know.
oh, absolutely. And for now, though, thank you very much for coming on and just kind of giving us a lot of information. If you're watching, you're probably going to need to go back and rewatch because Clay definitely dropped a lot of information about the whole Ford versus Ferrari history and everything, and just kind
I
of how
barely
that
even touched
all
on the
developed.
Ferrari thing, so
Oh,
and
I believe it.
that's a whole thing in itself.
Oh, I completely believe it. So I hope everybody got something interesting out of that, and if not, well, that's your problem. Uh,
Yeah, and you have to watch the beginning in order to get the philosophy aspect at it at the end.
oh, yeah, absolutely. And Well, we'll definitely be having Clay back on at some point in the not too distant future. And until next time, oh, I'm almost forgot to mention. Um, I'm not sure what I'm doing next week, but January 15th, I'll have Declan Finn back to talk about his new book series that's coming out. Um, I've had him on a few times. He's mostly known for his horror stuff, but he takes a little venture into the sci-fi land with this new series, and I'm actually a good chunk of the way into book 2 right now, and it's typically awesome. So if you want to hear about that, and also we'll probably get a little bit into what life is like in New York currently, because to my knowledge, that's still where he's based out of, and he's no more a fan of COVID stain than I am. So that should be an
I'm so
interesting
happy I don't live
conversation.
in LA.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'll have to. I'm just curious how like Whittle is dealing with all of that nonsense.
Oh, he hates it. Like there was a live stream a couple weeks ago, um, where he was just like talking about how everybody's moving to Florida, and he grew up in Florida, and he's like, I do not want to move back to Florida if anything can help it. And I commented, I'm like, why don't you just move out of LA? You don't have to leave
Yeah,
California. And
yeah.
he's like,
It's not L.A. or Florida.
yeah. And he's like, oh, I haven't considered that. But
I mean, Scott Ott lives over in Texas, so
yeah. Although something I do want to say about Bill though that is kind of serious is that
mm,
Bill does have the COVID right now, and he is
okay,
up there in years, and uh, it's really been affecting him and his wife bad. So if you can pray for Bill to have a speedy recovery out of this.
absolutely. And he's supposed to be having some surgery too in the very near future, isn't he?
Yeah,
He's got like little skin cancer going on.
yeah, yeah. Luckily, it's the least invasive form of skin cancer. It is. It's still skin cancer, but it's not melanoma. So,
Okay,
but yeah, he has the COVID right now, and he put out a statement on his website, which you can go see at the at Bill Whittle _com account,
hmm.
um, on what he
Well,
wrote.
rest assured of our prayers for Mr. Whittle and his lovely Russian bride. And yeah, and of course, should you talk to him, definitely say hi because big fan.
Yeah, I will.
And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, be good, happy new year, and keep fighting the good fight.